And we're looking at Malachi chapter 3, verses 7 through 12. And we've called it the prosecutor's offer. Recall that to this point, God has challenged Israel's several things about Israel: their love for Him, their lack of honor and respect for Him, their lack of faithfulness to the covenant, their contempt for the law, the priesthood's corruption, their penchant for marital infidelity and idolatry, and then the notion of a coming Messiah. In this fourth, actually fifth, I guess it is, courtroom scene, God shifts gears and offers a deal. He says, in essence, during this session, return to faithfulness and obedience, and I will restore all things. So this is a little bit different, because instead of just hammering away at Israel because of their shortcomings, he offers them a solution and a way out of their difficulty, at least their difficulty with him. In this scene, this courtroom scene, we're going to see God's mercy and patience front and center. So let's revisit the last verse from the previous session. It was, in fact, a transition from that segment to this one. And I'm speaking of Malachi 3:6. I'll read it again. Since I, Yahweh, do not go back on my promises, Yahweh is claiming his immutability, his unchanging character. You sons of Jacob have not perished. He says, because of this characteristic of mine, you still exist as a nation. So what's he really saying? He said, look, I have been patient and gracious toward Israel in the past, and I will be again if, and that's if is what we want to look at. God's made such an offer many times, one of the last being seen in Zechariah, also in Haggai, when the temple was rebuilt or was in the process of being rebuilt after the return from the captivity in Babylon. So this was several hundred years earlier. But Zechariah, well, maybe not quite several hundred years, but quite a spell. Zechariah 1:3. Therefore say to the people, the sovereign Lord says, turn to me, and I will turn to you. So God has made this offer before. It's not an offer he has to make. It's an offer he chooses to make. Now, when we skip over to verse 7, the next verse, we see Malachi making that same offer, the same offer that was made in Zechariah's day. Malachi 3:7. We're going to read eventually 7 through 12, but we'll just start with 7 first. From the days of your ancestors, you have ignored my commandments and have not kept them. So ever since you became a nation, you have violated my ordinances. But he then continues, return to me, and I will return to you, says the sovereign Lord. And then he says, but you say, how should we return? Well, God laid out the charge, of course, of violation of the law, but he opened the door for reconciliation. The offer, return to me, I'll return to you. Pretty straightforward. But the offer was challenged by a cynical question of response. How should we return? You know what they were really saying? They're playing like they don't know better. Again, it's a feigned ignorance. They're really saying, what do you mean, Lord? Return? We never left you. You left us. And of course, that's not true. They did leave God by idolatry, and other immoral acts. So God claimed in verse 6 that he's immutable, but the Israelites are subject to change. Their history gives a lot of examples of where they changed. They said, oh yeah, we'll follow the law, and they did for a while, and then bang, they were going a separate way. God offers one example, at least, in rebuttal, as he begins his rebuttal arguments, like he has done in all of the past cases. He says, can a person rob God? You indeed are robbing me. And then he adds this other question from them. But you say, how are we robbing you? They're saying, I don't know how we're robbing you, God. But as been the case in each of these, Malachi puts these words in Israel's mouth in the form of another how question. How have we robbed you? But God's more than able to meet such a challenge. We start in 3:8, part B, we read this, God's answer, in tithes and contributions, sacrifices and offerings. You are bound for judgment because you are robbing me. The whole nation is guilty. This is not 4, 5, 6 people, some of the 1% or whatever you want to call them that's doing this. He said, the Israelites as a nation of individuals, you've moved away from me by cheating me, by not giving me my full due under the covenant sacrificial system. Then in 3:10 part A, he says to counteract this, bring the entire tithe into the storehouse so that there may be food in my temple. His answer testified to their partial rather than their complete obedience. He says, bring the full tithe in. So they were probably bringing in some part of the tithe, maybe claiming even that it was the entire tithe. We don't know for a fact, but we do know from a previous round that they were offering unacceptable animals and products as the perfect sacrifice. So they were cheating him in a number of ways. The priests, as a matter of fact, in the second episode, the priests and the people were both charged with disrespecting God by offering gifts of inferior quality. Now they're charged with disrespecting him again through sacrifices of insufficient quantity. In other words, service in the name of God, and this is the point that I think is being made, service in the name of God must be of superior quality and sufficient quantity. Anything else smells of mediocrity and is an insult to God. I think that's the point that's being made. Here's a question for you. Believers today are prone to fall short in this area also in terms of offerings of time, talent, money, other valuables. So we're prone to cheat on that if you take the tithe as the standard. Not everyone takes the tithe as a standard. That's a debated issue in the New Testament. But the New Testament typically makes service more important and more difficult. And so the tithe doesn't seem out of place. But anyhow, the churches themselves as a whole even do this. Let me ask you this in the form of the question then. Is your church guilty of providing only mediocre service to the congregation, to the community, to God? Is service in all three of those categories mediocre, or is it excellent and plentiful? Well, consider also the word storehouse. You might wonder, what's he talking about? Just bring it to the temple and leave it? Well, Within the temple, there was a room where tithes and offerings, often in the form of crops, flocks, and herds, rather than gold or silver, were stored. And they were stored for a number of reasons. But Leviticus 27:30 points us out. Any tithe of the land, from the grain of the land or from the fruit trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. So there's an example, at least, that a product of crops is to be part of the tithe. So those things were brought in form rather than in hard cash. They were used to support priests and Levites in their work in the temple, for example. We read that in Numbers 18, beginning in verse 8. The Lord spoke to Aaron, "See, I've given you the responsibility for my raised offerings. I have given all the holy things of the Israelites to you by reason of your anointing, and to your sons as a perpetual ordinance." In other words, he's saying, part of these offerings go to you, Aaron. Verse 9, of all the most holy offerings reserved from the fire, this will be yours, every offering of theirs, whether from every grain offering of theirs, or every purification offering of theirs, or from every reparation offering of theirs, which they bring to me. They will be most holy for you and for your sons. You are to eat it in the most holy place. Every male may eat it. It will be holy to you. So it was actually part of the offerings and the sacrifices, as designated by the Lord, were to be food for the priests and the Levites who did the work in the temple. We saw earlier that there was a comment that that the priests were despising the table of the Lord, implying that they were ticked off of what they were getting to eat, perhaps. And this would be what it would be, something from the offerings. They permitted improper offerings, so they end up with improper food, and then they bellyache about it. But there were also yearly feasts and festivals that these tithes were to support. Deuteronomy 12, verses 5 through 7 say this: "But you must seek only the place He, God, chooses from all your tribes to establish His name as His place of residence. And you must go there, and there you must take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the personal offerings you have prepared, your votive offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks." So there's all that incoming stuff. "Both you and your families must feast there before the Lord and rejoice in all the output of your labor with which He has blessed you." In other words, they said, you earned it. It came from you, of course. But when you sacrifice it during these festivals, part of it goes to the ones who sacrificed it. So that was part of what this was about also. Then there was the notion of the poor. Yeah, going to read from Deuteronomy 14, verses 28 and 29. In other words, these offerings were to support the poor in Israel. It says, "At the end of every 3 years, you must bring all the tithe of your produce in that very year, and you must store it up in your villages. Then the Levites, because they have no allotment or inheritance with you, the allotment or resident foreigners," so they got Levites, resident foreigners, the orphans, and the widows of your villages may come and eat their fill, so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work you do. So God's acknowledging that they're giving back to Him some of the efforts of their labor. But then he's pointing out that it is God who has blessed that labor and made that possible anyhow. Let's start with the second half of verse 10 in Malachi 3. This is something a little bit unusual. It doesn't happen too often in Scripture. God says, "Test me in this matter," says the sovereign Lord, "to see if I will not open for you the windows of heaven and pour out for you a blessing until there is no room for it all." The principle is simple. You withhold your tithes and offerings, God will withhold blessings. You offer God these tithes and offerings, and you will receive blessings. That was under the law. So God said it's very clear cut. And the blessings of obedience can be great. For example, starting in verse 11, he says, "Then I will stop the plague from ruining your crops. The vine will not lose its fruit before harvest," says the sovereign Lord. "All nations will call you happy, for indeed you will live in a delightful land," says the sovereign Lord. So God says, you give me my due in terms of tithes and offerings, and I'll make sure that you are blessed out of your socks, and that the world will look at you and see the goodness of God. So Paul made a point of what sacrifice for service, sacrifice or satisfactory service for God looks like. He a little tongue-tied here. Romans 12, we've been there before a couple of times, but in verses 1 to 3, Paul says, "Therefore I exhort you, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a sacrifice, alive, holy, and pleasing to God, which is your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this present world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may test and approve what is the will of God, what is good and well-pleasing and perfect." And the word for reasonable service could also be translated reasonable worship. So he says, don't pay attention to what the world wants you to be. Be transformed from the world's mold to the perfect will of God. And verse 3, "For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you not to think more highly of yourself than you ought to think, but to think with sober discernment, as God has distributed to each of you a measure of faith." So if you feel that you can't do anything for God, you need to take a look around, see what your gifts are, see what your opportunities are, and know that God has you still here for a purpose. So put it all on the altar. Put it all on the altar and see what happens. But if you give God less than he deserves, this constitutes a form of neglect. So how do Christians neglect God? In what ways does your church appear to neglect God? Think about those questions. Because remember, a church does not have to continue to exist indefinitely. So think about those questions. Are we falling short in terms of what we do with our time, talents, and money, or material goods? But there's the other side of that question. What blessings might await your church if it is in full obedience? Well, so far it seems that Malachi is really a book on how to get right with God. And there are a number of commentators who have taken that view. How to get right with God. God saying, here's what's wrong, here's what's required. So what is our takeaway from this? Well, consider this. God's blessings are to bring honor to his name. We saw that. He said, you do right, I'll bless your socks off, and the whole world will see my goodness. So God's blessing is intended not only for our benefit, but for the benefit of the honor and glory of his name. Therefore, his blessings to us should produce testimony to his goodness. So remember, if you're blessed, make sure people know about it. Make sure they know it's God's doing, Make sure they know that you worship a good, compassionate, loving God. Well, we'll look at the last go round next time.